Hey guys! Welcome to our second Macroeconomics 2 workshop presented by the UNSW Economic Society. In this video, we'll be covering some midterm style questions. The topics that we'll be covering include the labour demand curve, inflation, monetary policy, and variations on the Roma model. Let's start off with a question about the labour demand curve. Question 1. True or false? An increase in the income tax causes the labour demand curve to shift inwards. This statement is false. An increase in income tax will affect the labour supply and not the labour demand. Firms pay a certain amount of wage and labour only retains the after-tax amount of that. Let's take, for example, firms pay a wage of $10 and the tax rate increased from 10% to 20%. Previously, labour will retain 90% of their wage, which is $9, but now they only retain 80%, which is $8, as the $2 goes to the government in the form of tax revenue. This reduction in wage provides a disincentive for people to work. Some may quit their job and drop out of the labour market altogether. Therefore, at any given wage paid by firms, workers receive less, hence the labour supply curve shifts inwards. Let's move on to a question about inflation. Question 2. True or false? If the output is above potential, so that YT is positive, the change in the inflation rate will be negative, so inflation will fall over time. This statement is false. In this question, actual output is above potential output, meaning that we have a positive output gap. This happens when demand is very high, and to meet this demand, factories and workers operate far above their most efficient capacity. All else equal, if the output gap is positive over time, so that actual output is greater than potential output, prices will begin to rise in response to demand pressure, which generates upward pressure on inflation. Therefore, the change in inflation will be positive. In the next question, we'll be discussing about monetary policy. Question 3. Explain how misunderstanding potential real GDP can lead to the wrong monetary policy. This question is a nice follow-on from question 2. The figure displays 3 curves. The first curve represents the true potential output of the economy. The second curve depicts the actual output of the economy. And the third curve is the perceived potential output of the economy. Curve 3 is what we believe the potential output of the economy to be. When implementing monetary policy, policymakers perceive the economy to be in expansion. As to them, actual output is above potential output, hence the output gap is positive. However, as we can clearly see from the figure, the economy is in fact in a recession because there is a negative output gap, since the actual output is actually below true potential output. This misunderstanding between the perceived state of the economy versus the true state will cause incorrect monetary policy to be implemented. To combat the perceived boom, policy advisors would put in place a contractionary monetary policy by increasing interest rates, which will in fact make the recession worse. Our last question will cover variations on the Roma model. Question 4. Consider the following variation to the Roma model. What is the growth rate of output in this economy? This question is asking for the growth rate of output. This is given by the change in YT plus 1 divided by YT, which is your output. We then use equation 1 from the previous slide at time periods t plus 1 and t to get the change in yt plus 1, and divide this by substituting in the same equation for yt at time t. Following on to the second line, we substitute 1 minus L bar for Ly t plus 1, using equations 3 and 4 in the previous slide. Remember, L is the fraction of the population that works in research, so we have 1 minus L remaining to work in producing output. The third line allows for 1 minus L bar to cancel out, as it is present in both the numerator and denominator. And line 4 is the same as writing at plus 1 to the power of a half over at to the power of a half minus at to the power of a half over at to the power of a half, which is equal to 1. Thus, we can simplify this to get at plus 1 to the power of a half over at to the power of a half minus 1 in the last line. We have now taken out the exponent of 1 over 2 and placed it outside of our brackets. Our goal is to get a growth rate of output which utilizes exogenous variables. Line 2 is an additional step that helps us to get there. This line is another way in which you can write the first line, but it reintroduces the term change in at plus 1, which we can then use to substitute in equation 2 from the question slide, as seen in line 3. In line 4, at in the numerator and at in the denominator cancel out, leaving us with a final growth rate of output, which is only dependent on exogenous variables. This brings us to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching and good luck for your exams.